The static shrieked, a piercing metallic laceration through the otherwise oppressive silence of the watchtower cabin. It was the sound of complete environmental collapse, the audible signature of a system failing precisely when it was needed most. Elias Thorne, barely 6 months into his tenure as a full-fledged ranger and still smelling faintly of university library dust, slammed his palm against the outdated radio console for the 10th time, his frustration a raw, burning counterpoint to the heat already radiating through the thin wooden walls. He knew with a certainty that iced the blood in his veins that the communications blackout was not a mere atmospheric anomaly. It was the final, choking embrace of the disaster that had been brewing silently in the high desert peaks for the last 3 weeks. The air outside was thick, viscous, and unnaturally orange. It pressed against the glass of the cabin's observation window like a desperate, starving beast. Elias leaned closer to the smoked plexiglass, shielding his eyes from the blinding glare of the afternoon sun, which had been transformed into a sickly, malevolent ember hanging low over the western ridge. It wasn't just heat he felt. It was the intense, vibrating compression that precedes a physical shockwave, the kind of silent pressure that shatters glass and warps steel. Beside him, Marcus Kane, the head ranger of the Redwood National Preserve, a man whose spine was seemingly molded from the ancient, unyielding wood of the very forest they were tasked with protecting, merely grunted. Kane had been a ranger since Elias was in diapers, possessed a face permanently weathered into skeptical lines, and considered any modern technology beyond a shovel and a handheld flare gun to be inherently suspect. He watched Elias's frantic attempts to raise the central command with an expression of profound, tired contempt. "Stop beating that old dog, Thorne," Kane drawled, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that barely cut through the rising whine of the wind outside. "She's dead. Static means the repeater station on Ponderosa Peak is gone." "And if Ponderosa Peak is gone?" Kane paused, his eyes narrowing as he looked past Elias, directly at the topographical map pinned messily on the wall. "Then we're running on borrowed oxygen, boy." The Ponderosa Peak repeater station was their umbilical cord, their single lifeline to civilization, and more importantly to the heavy water tankers and specialized aerial suppression teams waiting 40 miles downriver. Its silence confirmed the absolute worst. The fire, initially reported as a manageable 2-acre brush burn 12 hours ago, had metastasized into a catastrophic, wind-driven conflagration. Elias didn't need the radio to tell him. He could read the smoke. It wasn't the slow, lazy drift of burning timber. This was the fast-moving, coiling black column, the kind that indicated intense fuel consumption and the creation of its own lethal weather system. A firestorm. He grabbed the infrared thermal scanner, a piece of sophisticated equipment Kane openly despised, and focused it on the horizon. The reading flashed back instantly, brutally precise. The forward burn line was advancing at speeds exceeding 50 feet per second, fueled by a sudden, vicious surge of the notoriously dry and hot Santa Ana winds that had swept through the valley like a vengeful curse. "We don't have time for the standard protocol, Marcus," Elias said, his voice tight, the professionalism warring violently with the raw terror gripping his gut. "The fire jumped the primary brake line 10 minutes ago. It's not running toward the river. It's running straight for the timber depot and the old growth cluster. If it hits that depot, we lose the forest and half the town of Oakhaven goes up with the explosion." Kane, who was calmly coiling a spare length of heavy rope, finally looked at Elias, a flicker of something dangerously close to amusement crossing his stern features. "The standard protocol, rookie, is the only protocol that keeps us alive. We load the pack, we secure the equipment, and we get the hell out. We try to mitigate, not martyr ourselves. The depot is 3 miles away. We still have time to pull back to the secondary clearing. 3 miles is 10 minutes at this pace, Marcus. Less than that if the wind tunnels through that ravine," Elias retorted, stabbing a finger onto the map. He was pointing at a narrow, deep geological feature known locally as the Dragon's Throat, a natural chimney that would accelerate the already ferocious blaze into an unstoppable inferno. "And look at the trajectory. The head of the fire is veering north, straight toward this cabin. We are officially in the projected path of total annihilation, not just observation." Kane followed the line Elias traced, his confidence wavering for a fraction of a second, a minute, almost imperceptible twitch of the jaw that spoke volumes. The trajectory was indeed terrifyingly precise, an arrow pointing directly at their isolated, highly flammable wooden perch. But Marcus Kane had faced worse fires. He had outrun walls of flame 40 feet high. His skepticism of Elias was rooted less in arrogance and more in a deep-seated belief that experience trumped any amount of digitized data. "You're panicking, Thorne. The winds might shift back. They always do," Kane insisted, though his voice lacked its usual unshakable certainty. "They won't. Not this time. The microclimate data is clear. We are experiencing a full-scale thermal inversion right now. The pressure differential is locking the wind into this current path. We are looking at a 10-second window, Marcus. That is all the time we have left before the fire crests the ridge and the cabin becomes our crematorium." Elias paused, taking a deep, ragged breath. He had to make the old man understand the impossible choice facing them. They couldn't run. They couldn't fight it with conventional means. The fire was an avalanche, not an opponent. "We don't have time to secure the perimeter or lay backburns. We don't have time to call in the air support that can't hear us anyway. We have 10 seconds, maybe 15 at most, to stop the forward momentum of that blaze right now." And that was the moment Elias Thorne uttered the plan. The singular, insane, utterly reckless strategy he had calculated based on 3 sleepless nights spent poring over the cabin's ancient, forgotten blueprints and his own highly specialized, deeply buried past. A plan that involved no fire hoses, no shovels, and no retreat. It involved an act of calculated, localized destruction. He looked Kane straight in the eye, the reflection of the burgeoning blaze glowing in the despairing depths of his irises. "I am going to collapse the foundation of this cabin, Marcus." The response was immediate and visceral. The sound of Head Ranger Kane's laughter wasn't a chuckle or a scoff. It was a loud, raw bark of disbelief. A painful, cynical sound wrenched from the very core of a man who thought he had seen every flavor of foolishness the wilderness could offer. "You're going to what?" Kane roared, dropping the rope. The humor quickly curdled into genuine, incandescent fury. "You want to demolish the only structural observation point we have? Are you trying to kill us both, rookie? We are not fighting a siege, we are fighting a forest fire." Elias ignored the question, his hands already moving instinctively. He tore the rug from the floor, revealing a heavily bolted, reinforced steel hatch that looked entirely out of place in the rustic structure. This hatch was not on any standard-issue blueprint. It was a relic of the cabin's previous life, established during the Cold War as a covert seismic monitoring station. Kane knew the hatch existed, but believed it only led to a dusty storage crawlspace. Elias knew better. "This cabin is sitting directly above the natural fracture point in the ridgeline," Elias explained, his voice low and urgent, focused entirely on the task of wrenching the heavy bolts. "A minor fault line, dormant for decades but structurally weak. When they built this place 50 years ago, they installed a counterbalance system for stability, a network of obsolete, high-grade steel tension cables running beneath the floor and anchored deep into the bedrock. They were designed to stabilize the cabin against minor tremors, but they were also designed to be released." He pulled the last bolt free with a strained grunt, the steel groaning in protest. The air rushing up from the black void beneath the floor was damp and cool, smelling faintly of concrete dust and ozone, a blessed interruption to the scorching air above. Releasing the tension cables will destabilize the superstructure just enough. The collapse won't be vertical, it will be lateral, a calculated implosion that pulls the floor out from under the walls. It creates a localized, instantaneous ground displacement. A shockwave, Marcus. Small, sharp, and focused. Kane stared at the hole, then back at the advancing inferno that now lit the entire observation room in hellish red and yellow hues. He finally understood the kernel of madness in Elias's plan, and it terrified him far more than the approaching fire. "You're trying to create a physical displacement to snuff out the advancing front?" Kane whispered, his experienced mind calculating the probability. "That's insane, Thorne. You'll need military-grade explosives for that. You'll need tons of C4. This is just an old cable release system." "It's not to snuff it out, Marcus. It's to divert it," Elias corrected, already swinging his legs into the narrow access shaft. The space below was cramped, dark, and littered with discarded heavy-gauge wiring. The fire needs a steady, uninterrupted path of fuel to sustain this rate of speed. When I trigger the collapse, the localized shock will momentarily disrupt the Earth's surface directly beneath the leading edge of the blaze. It will literally trip the fire. Not enough to stop it entirely, but enough to create a momentary void, a sudden, unpredictable shift in the fuel geometry. It forces the current to stall, and more importantly, it buys us the 30 seconds we need for the fire to seek the path of least resistance, which, if I've calculated correctly, will be a sharp swerve toward the less fueled scrubland to the south, diverting the bulk of the burn away from the depot and the old growth. It was an audacious, mathematically absurd gamble, a precise application of seismic disturbance and fluid dynamics to a raging natural phenomenon. It was the kind of theoretical thinking that earned doctoral degrees, not respect in the trenches of the U.S. Forest Service. "And what if your calculation is wrong, Thorne?" Kane challenged, his voice cracking with the strain of holding on to his traditional rationale. "What if you just bring the entire ridge down on top of us? What if that minor fault line isn't so minor after 50 years of pressure?" Elias was already deep within the recess, his headlamp illuminating a dense, terrifying tangle of ancient, color-coded wires, all coated in 50 years of dust and spiderwebs. He located the primary actuation block, a heavy, rust-pitted lever labeled only with a faded military stencil. "If I'm wrong, Marcus," Elias called up, the sound muffled by the concrete shaft, "we die under the wreckage of this cabin, which is the exact same outcome we face in 10 seconds if we do nothing. The only difference is that if I'm right, the Redwood Preserve survives." He reached for the lever. It was cold and heavy under his glove. The sounds from outside had intensified into a howling crescendo. The roar of the fire was no longer just approaching, it was present. He could feel the superheated air pressing down on the exposed skin of his neck, and the thick scent of burning pine pitch and incinerated earth was suffocating. Marcus Kane, paralyzed by the conflicting instincts of decades of service and the chilling logic of the rookie's math, stood above the shaft, watching the blinding red glow approaching the window. He could see the leading edge now, not defined flames, but waves of heat distortion shimmering above the timberline. "Thorne, stop, that's an order," Kane bellowed, reverting instantly to his ranger authority, the deep-seated military discipline taking over the panicked civilian within him. "We run, now! Grab the emergency pack. We still have 3 seconds to reach the reinforced bunker." But Elias had already committed. He had run the numbers, the structural analysis, the thermal models, and the probability of success, which, against all sanity, registered at 68.4%, in the face of certain doom, 68. 4 was a winning lottery ticket. He placed both hands on the heavy metal lever. He needed precision, timing, and absolute, unflinching resolve. He had to account for the physical lag time of the steel cables, the structural degradation of the wood frame, and the precise moment the fire's crown passed over the fault line. 10 seconds. The arbitrary yet terrifying deadline he had set for himself was nearly upon them. Elias braced himself against the concrete wall, took a final strained gasp of the cool subterranean air, and prepared to execute the single most absurd, desperate, and potentially catastrophic maneuver ever conceived in the long traditional history of the Redwood National Preserve Fire Service. The fire roared, the walls began to vibrate with the sheer proximity of the heat, and Elias Thorne, the rookie, pulled the lever. The heavy metallic groan that ripped through the structure was immediately followed by a terrifying sharp crack that signaled the beginning of the end, or the beginning of the save. The absurdity has been enacted, but the outcome is unknown. To be continued in Part 2, where the immediate consequences of the absurd move and the resulting physical shockwave are analyzed. The laughter of Captain Thorne, that dry, guttural sound of seasoned contempt, still echoed in the hollow cavity of Lookout 7. It was a lingering acoustic artifact, trapped between the peeling laminate of the desk and the outdated console that now blinked maniacally, a harbinger of environmental collapse. Finn, the rookie, found the isolation of the fire tower terrifyingly absolute, amplified by the data screaming at him from the monitors. This was not merely a fire. This was a geological insult, a thermal wave traveling at speeds that mathematically required an internal combustion engine, not just dry brush and wind. He didn't have minutes. He had, perhaps, the length of a single, deeply inhaled breath before the initial heat shock wave hit the geographical choke point. This choke point, known locally and irreverently as the Serpent's Gullet, was the single narrow canyon that accelerated the prevailing westerly winds to catastrophic velocities. Thorne, in his 30 years managing Sector Delta, had always treated the gullet as a scenic viewpoint, ignoring the detailed climatological studies from the late 90s that explicitly warned against its potential for creating localized atmospheric hyperacceleration during extreme drought. Thorne had laughed at the studies, just as he had laughed at Finn moments ago. Finn wiped a bead of sweat from his temple, the salt stinging his eye. He pivoted away from the communications console, abandoning the useless hope of re-establishing contact. The radio silence was total, a blanket of static signifying that the relay station atop Mount Ascalon had either succumbed to the preliminary smoke damage or, more likely, had been deliberately shut down by Thorne's command center to prioritize traffic from other less alarmist sectors. Finn was now officially off the grid, an unperson trapped in a wooden cage 3,000 feet above the valley floor. The cabin itself was a relic, built in the early 1950s and maintained with institutional apathy. Every piece of equipment was oversized, heavy, and functionally redundant, save for one crucial, overlooked component, the meteorological array's original core processor. While the modern satellite link had failed, this older system still possessed independent power cycling capabilities, and critically, a highly sensitive pressure transducer array originally designed to measure localized earthquake tremors, not mere atmospheric anomalies. This was the key, not fighting the fire but fighting the wind that fed it. Finn dropped to his knees, ignoring the searing pain in his worn joints. He yanked open the floor access panel, the metal grating screaming in protest, disturbing a cloud of fine grey dust that smelled faintly of ozone and dead mice. Beneath the cabin floor lay the historical repository of Ranger neglect, old fuel canisters, frayed ropes, and the long-forgotten emergency cache designed for a 6-month isolation scenario. He wasn't looking for water or rations. He was hunting for the volatile chemical agents listed in the inventory manifest of 78, the high-density magnesium flares and the extremely specialized experimental atmospheric dispersal charges, or ADCs. These ADCs, developed under a highly secretive program abandoned due to excessive cost and negligible utility against conventional forest fires, were precisely the element Thorne would never have accounted for. They were essentially contained packets of super-cooled inert gas designed to be deployed from slow-moving aircraft to create temporary high-pressure barriers meant to choke oxygen availability in localized hotspots. They were intended for controlled burns gone rogue, not for a catastrophe of this scale, and certainly not for ground deployment. Finn located the crate, a heavy wooden box secured with thick, rusted wire. He used the butt of his emergency axe to smash the locking mechanism, the splintering wood adding another frantic, dissonant sound to the impending symphony of destruction. Inside, wrapped in yellowed, brittle paper, were 6 spherical canisters, each the size of a bowling ball and colored a dull, menacing cobalt blue. The labels, stamped with an archaic government seal, warned of extreme pressure differential hazard. The plan that Thorne had laughed at, the move that felt absolutely absurd even to Finn, was now the only conceivable option, deploying the ADCs not to smother the fire, but to abruptly shift the atmospheric pressure within the Serpent's Gullet. If executed perfectly, and the chances of perfection under these constraints were infinitesimally small, the sudden influx of super-cold, high-density inert gas would briefly create a vacuum effect, drawing the bulk of the accelerated flame front upward, separating it from its ground fuel source, and momentarily disrupting the catastrophic venturi effect that was making the fire unstoppable. This was not extinguishing the blaze. It was creating a 10-second temporal interruption, a heartbeat of sanity in an insane inferno. He began the grueling process of rigging the charges. The ADCs were designed to be airdropped, meaning they lacked ground deployment triggers. Finn had to jury-rig them using the obsolete meteorological equipment, He tore the copper wiring from the back of the vintage pressure transducer and quickly began splicing it to the detonators on the ADCs. His fingers, usually steady, were trembling violently, driven by the knowledge that a single misplaced wire, a momentary lapse in concentration, would turn the cabin into a pressurized bomb, vaporizing him instantly. He remembered the scoff Thorne gave him, the way the head ranger had leaned back, his uniform jacket pulling tight across his expansive chest, the sun glinting off his gold insignia. 10 seconds, Ranger. That's not a plan, that's a hallucination. Get real, Finn. Fire doesn't wait for parlor tricks. Thorne hadn't understood that Finn's experience wasn't in textbook fire dynamics, but in predictive atmospheric modeling, his true expertise developed during a brief, highly stressful stint with the Alaskan Weather Service, a stint that ended abruptly after he had miscalculated a microburst event, leading to the destruction of a critical communications array. That failure, that memory of misjudgment, was the anchor that drove his current, desperate accuracy. He would not be wrong again. The cost was too high. The immediate conflict now was synchronization. To work, the pressure shift had to occur precisely when the fire reached the geometric apex of the gullet, where the natural compression was highest. If deployed too soon, the inert gas would dissipate harmlessly. Too late, and the fire would be past the bottleneck, spreading into the vulnerable, dense cedar groves beyond. He needed to synchronize the deployment to the precise micro-pressure reading from the antiquated transducer, which required a stable power source. He wrestled with the massive lead-acid backup battery, a beast of a thing designed to power the original radio for a week. He dragged it across the wooden floor, the heavy scraping sound like a desperate moan in the stillness. The battery cables were thick and brittle. He stripped the insulation with his pocket knife, his breath hitching as he inadvertently nicked the copper core. 3 minutes elapsed. On the obsolete CRT screen, the ominous red scar on the map had thickened, approaching the geographical boundary marked by the cross-hatched lines of the gullet. The display was refreshing at agonizingly slow intervals, every 20 seconds. This 20-second delay was a canyon he had to leap. He couldn't wait for visual confirmation. He needed the raw, instantaneous data. Finn finally managed to connect the ADCs to the heavy battery, bypassing all safety regulators. The canisters were now live, ticking time bombs responsive only to his manual input. He then moved to the second phase of the absurd move, physical structural modification of the cabin itself. The cabin was supposed to be a lookout, a sanctuary. Finn needed it to be a massive, resonant antenna capable of channeling the impending atmospheric chaos. He grabbed the emergency crowbar and began brutally tearing up the sheet metal panels protecting the cabin's external observation deck railing. The metal shrieked and bent, the sound loud enough to be heard perhaps a mile away, but utterly irrelevant against the backdrop of the oncoming catastrophe. He needed that metal, specifically the ferrous content of the railing structure, to serve as a conductive element for the massive static electricity discharge that always preceded such high-velocity thermal events. He worked with a frenetic energy that bordered on mania, spurred on by the sudden terrifying change in the ambient air temperature. It wasn't just hot, it was chemically sterile, the humidity levels dropping so rapidly that the very air tasted dry, metallic, and devoid of moisture. His skin felt tight, his eyes gritty. This was the fire pulling the moisture from the air ahead of its advance, a phenomenon known only to meteorologists studying extreme drought conditions. He affixed 2 of the cobalt spheres, the ADCs, to the newly exposed metal railing, securing them tightly with industrial zip ties retrieved from the inventory cupboard. These were his primary effectors. The remaining 4 ADCs he distributed strategically around the cabin's perimeter, focusing them toward the valley floor, creating a dispersed field. The concept was terrifyingly simple, yet professionally insane. The initial focused discharge from the railing-mounted ADCs would trigger the localized pressure vacuum at the gullet's apex. The 4 peripheral ADCs, triggered milliseconds later via a complex daisy chain he was now constructing with salvaged radio wire, would ensure the pressure difference stabilized immediately afterward, preventing a dangerous backdraft that could sweep the fire right back up the face of the mountain toward the tower. He looked at the chronometer embedded in the console, 17:34:05. The red scar on the map jumped forward. The gullet was now less than 1,000 yards away. He threw himself back toward the old processor panel, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He needed the raw data feed, bypassing the sluggish mapping interface. He found the access port, a dust-caked 5-pin array, and plugged in the manual override cable he always carried. A piece of salvaged military tech that made the old Rangers scoff, calling it overkill. The screen flooded with numerical data. It wasn't a map anymore. It was a pure statistical onslaught of wind shear, localized temperature spikes, and most critically, the rapidly collapsing barometric pressure reading at the Serpent's gullet. Pressure reading, 982 mappin, 975 mappin. The rapid decline was the fire's sonic boom. The air was being violently displaced. Finn saw the critical threshold approaching, 965 millibars. That was the point of no return, the apex of the Venturi acceleration. He couldn't hesitate. He held the manual firing switch, a crude copper paddle switch wired directly to the battery and the explosives, in his sweaty palm. He checked the structural integrity of his setup one last time. The wires were taut, the canisters stable. He was ready to sacrifice the entire observation deck and potentially his own life, based on a theoretical calculation dismissed by every authority figure in the region. Suddenly, an unmistakable, terrifying sound cut through the whine of the cooling fan and the frantic static. Not the distant roar of the fire itself, but the high-pitched rhythmic whistle of the hyper-accelerated wind. It was hitting the mouth of the gullet. The tower groaned, swaying slightly on its deep concrete pilings, a structural cry of distress. Dust and dried leaves, remnants of the world the fire was consuming, began to pepper the exterior glass panels with the force of tiny projectiles. Pressure reading, 970 mappin. He felt the sudden, distinct drop in temperature on the side of the cabin facing the wind, immediately followed by an almost unbearable spike of heat on the side facing the valley. The air turbulence was violently swirling. This was the moment, the empirical confirmation that the data was not lying. The fire was about to turn the corner. He stared at the screen, his vision blurring slightly from the sheer adrenaline coursing through his system. His finger hovered over the copper paddle switch. He knew exactly how many seconds it would take for the electrical impulse to travel the wire, detonate the ADCs, and for the inert gas to achieve maximum pressure differential. The calculation was brutal, demanding absolute precision. The data flashed. 967. 3 milliseconds, he calculated. 3 milliseconds too early. He held his breath, his eyes glued to the numbers that represented the fate of 1,000,000 acres of pristine forest. The roar outside intensified from a whistle to a deafening, continuous scream. He thought of Thorn, laughing. He thought of the sheer, reckless confidence that had led the head ranger to dismiss the threat. It wasn't just arrogance. It was institutional blindness. The tower shuddered violently again, and a small crack, thin as a hair, appeared on the main viewing window. 966, Miba 2. One more heartbeat, one more internal count. The sound was so overwhelming now that he couldn't hear his own ragged breathing. Everything was noise, heat, and pressure. The screen flickered, seemingly struggling to keep up with the catastrophic changes. The tension was an almost physical weight on his shoulders. He felt the static charge building on his hair, standing on end, signaling the immense energy about to be unleashed. 965 Mach T, the critical threshold. His thumb slammed down onto the switch, the copper contact completing the circuit with a sharp, definitive click that was entirely swallowed by the surrounding cacophony. He had 10 seconds left, not to save the forest, but to witness the absurd move either succeed in its infinitesimal window of opportunity or to simply be vaporized by the backlash of a catastrophic failure. The fate of everything now hinged on the unpredictable volatile chemistry contained within 6 cobalt spheres and a rookie ranger's desperate calculation. The detonation sequence was underway, a chain of events that would either create an impossible pocket of calm in the midst of the inferno or accelerate the disaster beyond imagining. The first flash of cold, blinding light from the exterior railing slammed through the already stressed viewing window, followed instantly by the deep, resonant thump of the primary ADCs discharging. The tower was immediately enveloped in a shockwave that wasn't heat, but pure, raw atmospheric force. The deafening concussion arrived not as a gradual whisper swelling into a roar, but as an instantaneous physical slap against the structure, a seismic shockwave of thermal energy that slammed into the tiny cabin. The glass of the main window, already weeping and distorting under the unimaginable heat radiating from the adjacent ridge, exploded inward, atomizing into glittering dust motes and razor shards that instantly vanished into the turbulent, superheated air. This was the moment the countdown clock in Elias's mind, which had frozen at 1 second, ceased to matter, replaced by the crushing reality of zero time remaining. Barnaby, the veteran head ranger, whose confidence had curdled into rigid horror only moments before, let out a choked, soundless gasp. His world was reduced to the color of blinding orange, and the smell of pitch turning to smoke, thick and sweet and suffocatingly instantaneous. He had seen hundreds of fires, had fought dozens, but he had never been encased within the epicenter of a flash firestorm like this, where the atmosphere itself seemed to combust in protest. And yet, the cabin, impossibly, did not immediately disintegrate. This was the bizarre anomaly, the instant validation of Elias's ludicrous, desperate action. The fire had hit the outer shell, yes, the roar was still tearing at their eardrums, but instead of the immediate, total structural compromise that Barnaby's decades of experience screamed was inevitable, the instantaneous ignition of the dry cedar siding and the breaching of the inner walls, there was a bizarre momentary stutter in the Inferno's advance. Elias had not fought the fire with water or retardant. He had fought it with an obscure, forgotten principle of thermal dynamics related to materials science and antique construction methods. His move, the action that Barnaby had laughed at, a manic, almost ceremonial act of violence against the cabin's interior, was tearing down the lower 5 feet of the century-old varnished pine paneling that wrapped around the northeast corner of the main living area. He had done this with a single brutal kick, and then, using a stray, heavy fire poker, he had pried loose the dense-aged planks until they split, revealing the hidden cavity behind. The cavity, he knew from an obscure, dusty field manual detailing pre-war forestry construction, was not filled with modern insulation, nor was it simply empty air. It was packed, loosely but thoroughly, with a fine, granular mixture of dried silica sand and pulverized shale, an archaic, completely inefficient, but crucially non-combustible firebreak installed by cautious builders 100 years prior. This material was not meant to stop a wildfire. It was meant to slow the ingress of heat long enough for occupants to escape a controlled internal flue fire. But under the cataclysmic pressures of the current blaze, the sudden exposure of this dense, cool, and highly conductive mass of material created a momentary, radical heat sink precisely where the bulk of the thermal energy was attempting to transfer through the wall frame. The radiant heat, instead of immediately heating the internal wooden studs to their kindling point, was suddenly drawn into the cool, dark sand cavity, creating a localized, bizarre thermal vacuum. It was a pattern interrupt in the very nature of combustion's spread. Elias, sweating profusely, his face streaked with soot and terror, did not look at Barnaby. He watched the exposed section of sand and shale, which was already beginning to steam violently, as the ambient air within the small space was instantly flashed off, leaving behind a dark, smoldering barrier. It wasn't stopping the fire. It was merely buying milliseconds by diverting the fire's immediate focused energy away from the primary load-bearing supports. "The air," Elias choked out, his voice hoarse against the roar that still enveloped them. "It's trying to equalize. It needs oxygen, Barnaby. It needs that wood." The fire, like a frustrated, hungry beast, seemed momentarily confused. The heat, now entering the cabin, was channeled almost entirely toward that single, compromised section of the wall, forcing the Inferno to burn unevenly, inefficiently, wasting precious energy trying to overcome the massive, unexpected thermal gradient. Barnaby stumbled back, tripping over a fallen piece of paneling. His eyes were wide, not with fear for his life, which was paramount, but with an incomprehension that defied his entire professional existence. He looked at the exposed sand, then at the still intact sections of the opposite wall, and then at Elias, the rookie he had mocked minutes ago for his perceived overreaction. "The sand," Barnaby whispered, the word nearly lost. "It's channeling it. You've created a temporary furnace flue inside the wall." "It's a funnel," Elias corrected, his breathing shallow. "The fire is greedy. It seeks the easiest path to the greatest volume of fuel. We just made this small section the path of least resistance for the initial heat transfer. It's a trick of inertia. But it won't hold. 10 seconds to save the forest," he said. 10 seconds to make it think we weren't here, I hoped. The structural integrity of the cabin, however, was already compromised in secondary ways. While the primary wall was momentarily shielded, the ceiling joists exposed to the terrifying swirling heat entering through the shattered window frame began to creak and protest with sharp, pistol-shot noises. The thermal pressure inside the cabin was now monstrous. The air was thick, heavy, and already dangerously oxygen-depleted. Every breath they took was searing their throats, tasting metallic and acrid. This bought moment, this crucial, inexplicable 3 seconds of reprieve after the theoretical zero mark, was also magnifying a new, more insidious threat: flashover. The interior materials that had not yet ignited were quickly approaching their self-ignition temperature. The synthetic fibers of Barnaby's own uniform, the plastic casing of the radio transmitter sitting uselessly on the table, the papers stored in the filing cabinet, all were cooking, waiting for the slightest trigger. Elias knew the danger. The localized heatsink had worked, but it had superheated the rest of the small enclosed space. He needed to counteract the internal pressure immediately to introduce fresh air or displace the deadly, high-temperature gases gathering near the ceiling. Without preamble, Elias lunged toward the heavy iron stove that sat in the center of the cabin, the very stove that Barnaby had used to brew coffee less than an hour earlier. It was cold now, thankfully, but it represented an enormous mass of metal. Barnaby watched in disbelief as the rookie ranger, seemingly immune to the sensory assault around him, began wrestling with the heavy, disconnected stovepipe that led vertically through the roof aperture. "What are you doing now? The roof is collapsing," Barnaby yelled, finally finding his voice, but the sound was thin and weak. "Ventilation, we need a clean chimney effect. We're going to suffocate before we burn." Elias gasped, grunting with the effort. He managed to dislodge the heavy, sooty pipe segment nearest the stove collar. As soon as it fell, clanging to the wooden floor, a perverse, sickening sound echoed through the cabin. A short, sharp whoosh of air being violently drawn down the chimney flue, reversing the expected flow. The fire, which was licking hungrily at the exposed sand cavity in the wall, momentarily hesitated again. The sudden, forced downdraft through the chimney aperture created a chaotic air current inside the cabin, pulling some of the superheated air near the ceiling down and toward the floor, disrupting the formation of the deadly thermal layer. It was an impossible calculation, a gamble based on a forgotten aspect of fluid dynamics. Exploiting the pressure differential between the inferno outside and the momentary vacuum created by the sudden heat sink in the wall, using the chimney as a makeshift reverse extraction system. Barnaby stared at the exposed stove collar, where a thin, unnatural plume of smoke, air violently pulled in from the hellscape above, was emerging. The fire was no longer just a wall of heat. It was now a complex, dynamic ecosystem, and Elias was frantically manipulating its variables. The head ranger's mind raced, attempting to categorize this madness. It wasn't firefighting, it was battlefield engineering under duress. Elias had not simply bought 10 seconds. He had used those seconds to fundamentally change the geometry of the threat. But the reprieve was fleeting. The sand cavity, having absorbed an astronomical amount of heat in mere moments, was reaching its saturation point. A faint, low sizzle emanated from the exposed wall, the sound of water vapor being driven violently from the deeply embedded shale. When the sand fully heated, the effect would reverse, turning the wall into a radiator, cooking them from the inside out with terrifying efficiency. "The radio," Barnaby finally commanded, recognizing that action, however futile, was the only antidote to the paralyzing horror. "We have to get a transmission out now. Tell them the coordinates. Tell them the fire isn't behaving like a conventional crown fire. Tell them—" Elias didn't respond. He had moved on to his next desperate, counterintuitive move. He ripped a heavy, moth-eaten woolen blanket, the kind used for emergency hypothermia, from a hook near the door and began tearing it into long, thick strips. Wool, though combustible, burns slowly and inconsistently, producing dense, white smoke rather than rapid flame. "Don't worry about the outside," Elias instructed, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. "Worry about the pressure differential. When the sand fails, the heat will rush into this space like a wave. We need to insulate the remaining vulnerable points." Barnaby watched aghast as Elias began furiously stuffing the strips of wool into the gaps surrounding the wooden door frame and the smaller window opposite the shattered one. It was a move against oxygen ingress, against the very element the fire needed, but it seemed ludicrously small compared to the magnitude of the disaster. Yet Elias wasn't trying to seal the whole cabin. He was sealing the low-level leaks, aiming to maintain the chaotic internal pressure system he had engineered. "If the outside pressure finds too many inlets, the air currents I created will collapse and will get an immediate flashover," Elias explained, speaking now with the clipped, urgent authority of a seasoned tactical commander. "We must keep the fire hungry for air and force it to find its air supply through the exposed hole. If it finds air elsewhere, it will burn the entire structure simultaneously." The air was getting thinner. Barnaby felt his head swim. The low, guttural roar of the fire outside had modulated, changing pitch into a higher, more frantic whine. It sounded less like a natural phenomenon and more like an industrial boiler screaming at maximum pressure. Barnaby, momentarily forgetting his rank and years of experience, lowered himself to the floor, instinctively seeking the marginally cooler, cleaner air near the planks. He saw the fire poker Elias had used, still resting near the ripped-open wall, and noticed the bizarre localized effect. The floorboards immediately adjacent to the sand cavity were steaming, but the wood itself was not charred. A foot away, however, the intense thermal energy being re-radiated from the main blast had already scorched the floor dark. The heat sink was still functional, but only barely. It was holding the line, forcing the fire to bottleneck, but the consequence was that the temperature gradient within the cabin was becoming dangerously extreme, scorching heat near the ceiling and relative coolness near the floor. Elias finished stuffing the last strips of wool into the window frame, sealing it tight. He turned, his body language strained but determined, and looked directly at Barnaby. "It worked," Elias whispered, almost a prayer. "The first 10 seconds are ours. We didn't save the forest, but we avoided the immediate annihilation of the cabin's frame." Barnaby slowly pushed himself up, leaning heavily against the charred table. He looked past Elias, past the dark, steaming patch of sand, toward the door, the one route of escape, now completely engulfed in the blinding light of the inferno. "But the second 10 seconds, Elias," Barnaby rasped, his voice raw with realization. "What did your absurd move buy us? It bought us life, yes, but it bought us life trapped inside a pressure cooker, waiting for the walls to fail, and the fire is still raging. We're shielded, but we are prisoners. We are inside the eye of a very small, very temporary storm, and outside the forest is gone." The head ranger took a painful, burning breath, the smoke stinging his lungs. His gaze was no longer mocking, but intensely analytical, terrified and utterly reliant on the rookie. "You saved the cabin from instant consumption by changing the physics of the fire's approach. But now, what's the next variable? What happens when the structural studs directly above that sand cavity finally succumb to the cumulative heat?" As if in direct answer to his question, a sharp cracking sound tore through the cacophony. It was not the sound of fire, but the sound of wood fibers snapping under unbearable thermal load. A thin, dark line appeared on the ceiling, originating precisely above the engineered heatsink. The line rapidly elongated, accompanied by a small, gravelly shower of aged dust and plaster falling onto the floor. The rookie's absurd move had prevented the initial disaster, but it had only delayed and redirected the inevitable consequence of a mega fire hitting a century-old structure. The roof was now beginning to fail, and unlike the walls, there was no sand barrier hidden in the ceiling cavity. The only thing separating them from the searing atmosphere above was thin, aged shingle and dry, untreated lumber. Elias looked up at the widening fissure, his face pale beneath the soot. His quick thinking had bought them not escape, but merely a strategic advantage in a defensive war they could not possibly win. They had managed to survive the 10-second annihilation, only to enter a protracted battle against physics, gravity, and the relentless, suffocating heat. The clock had stopped, but the true terror had just begun. There was only one move left that could possibly mitigate the ceiling collapse, a move so outlandish, so destructive to the cabin itself, that it defied all protocol. Elias knew he had to act before the fissure fully compromised the main joist. He glanced around the deteriorating structure, his eyes seeking the one remaining object that possessed enough mass and leverage to change the geometry of the impending collapse, before turning back to Barnaby, the look in his eyes conveying a mix of desperate certainty and profound apology. "We have to force the collapse, Barnaby," Elias stated, his voice now dangerously calm. "We have to choose where the roof fails, or it will choose for us, and we are not in a position to survive random failure." Barnaby stared back, unable to formulate a response to the tactical suicide Elias was proposing. To force the structural failure of the roof was to invite the inferno inside, sacrificing their only remaining protection for a theoretical chance at creating a controlled escape route, a route that might lead directly into a wall of flame. The next second was deafeningly silent, save for the increasing snap and crackle above their heads, marking the structural compromise that was sealing their fate. The absurdity of their predicament was complete. The rookie who saved them from a fire by exposing a wall was now planning to save them from a collapsing roof by actively destroying it. The question of how Elias planned to execute this final terrible gambit hung in the superheated air, thick with the scent of burning resin and desperation. The fate of the forest and their lives depended entirely on the next impossible, devastating move. The heat pressed against the reinforced glass of the observation deck, a physical, sickening weight that made the air inside the cabin thick and difficult to draw in. Outside, the world was no longer green and serene. It was a roaring, incandescent hellscape. Marcus, the head ranger, felt the tremor of the earth beneath his feet, not from the fire itself, but from the systemic collapse unfolding around them. The red counter on the primary monitoring panel had frozen, stuck eternally at 0003, 3 seconds from the predicted moment of irreversible ecological catastrophe, the point where the main fuel path, the dry ravine known locally as the Serpent's Tongue, would be fully engulfed, rendering aerial bombardment moot and condemning the entire western sector of the Oakhaven Reserve. The secondary alarm, the one Marcus had spent 20 years hoping never to hear, shrieked. A high-pitched metallic complaint signifying a total failure of the networked suppression system, the very digital brain meant to safeguard their sanctuary. "It's gone, Liam, it's all gone," Marcus roared, his voice cracking with a raw, panicked despair that echoed the sound of splintering timber just beyond the boundary line. He spun toward the rookie, who stood rooted next to the massive, antiquated server rack, the very rack Marcus had mocked just minutes prior, where Liam had performed his inexplicable, absurd ritual of crossing 2 completely unrelated, color-coded wires. The movement had been pointless, counterintuitive, and now demonstrably suicidal. The rookie, however, did not flinch. Liam's gaze was fixed not on the raging inferno or the flashing red lights, but on a small dusty pressure gauge discreetly located beneath the console, a piece of hardware so old its brass casing was tarnished green. It was an artifact, a relic of the initial, pre-digital construction phase of the station, meant for manual water pressure monitoring decades ago, now simply a decorative lump of historical irony. "Wait for it, Ranger Marcus," Liam said, his voice a low, unnervingly steady counterpoint to the surrounding pandemonium. "We haven't reached the threshold yet." "The threshold? The threshold is that fire licking at the fuel tanks 500 yards away. You destroyed the network. You shorted the main relay, Liam. You cut us off from any chance of a last-ditch override." Marcus strode toward the young man, his fists balled, a primal instinct demanding he seize the rookie and shake sense back into him, demanding accountability for the generations of forest that were about to vanish in smoke. But before Marcus could reach him, a sound ripped through the cabin, a profound, deep-throated thunk that originated directly beneath the floorboards. It was followed instantly by a terrifying, escalating hydraulic whine, a sound that spoke of massive, constrained energy suddenly unleashed, like the groaning of a subterranean beast awakening from a long slumber. Dust motes danced violently in the beam of the emergency light, disturbed by the vibration now pulsing up through the floor. Marcus stopped dead. That sound, while it was familiar yet utterly impossible, he had heard it only once before during a system check in 2004, and even then, only faintly. It was the sound of the legacy pressure system, a network of underground pipes designed to feed a long-decommissioned water reservoir, a system that had been deemed redundant and capped off nearly 15 years prior. "What did you do?" Marcus whispered, the terror in his voice giving way to a nascent, terrifying understanding. Liam finally shifted his focus from the gauge to Marcus, and for the first time, Marcus saw not the nervous rookie, but a man who had already processed 10 outcomes and was waiting calmly for the 11th. "You laughed, Ranger Marcus, because the diagram I requested was outdated," Liam began, speaking quickly now as the whine turned into a deafening, metallic scream. "You assumed I was trying to manually reroute the digital command structure after the system failed, but I wasn't. The digital system was corrupted and irreversible. I was looking for the back door, the physical failsafe." Liam pointed to the antique server rack, the wires he had crossed now smoking slightly at the connection point. "When I analyzed the original blueprints, not the sanitized digital versions, I noticed something everyone in the last 2 decades has forgotten. Before the automated firewalls and GPS-guided tankers, this cabin wasn't just a control center. It was the terminal junction for the original, non-networked pressure feed." The high-pitched screech climaxed, sounding like tearing steel. Outside, the orange glow intensified, and Marcus could see the shadowy silhouettes of trees beginning to vaporize in the intense heat. They were seconds away from being overrun. "That old pressure gauge," Liam continued, his voice straining above the noise, "doesn't measure water pressure anymore. When the reservoir was decommissioned, they didn't remove the entire pipe system. They repurposed the core pressure loop. They buried the control node under the cabin and filled the reservoir with something else." Suddenly, the pressure gauge Marcus had glanced at dismissively rocketed to maximum capacity, hitting the red pin with a sharp ping. "It's a chemical suppression matrix, Ranger Marcus," Liam explained, the revelation hitting Marcus like a physical blow. It wasn't designed for forest fires. It was designed for a worst-case scenario. A catastrophic multi-million-dollar equipment fire inside the control cabin itself. A halon-based retardant, mixed with magnesium suppressants, pressurized to incredible levels, meant to flood the immediate vicinity of the junction point. Marcus reeled backward, the pieces snapping into place with sickening clarity. The absurd move was not an attempt to save the whole forest digitally, but an absolute reckless gamble to trigger an obsolete localized system designed to protect the equipment. A system that, by a miracle of geographical placement, sat precisely at the most vulnerable point of the fire's current path, the narrow entrance to the Serpent's Tongue ravine. "And how did you activate a system designed for internal hardware fires?" Marcus managed to choke out. "The digital activation code was corrupted," Liam said simply. "But the legacy failsafe was manual and power-dependent. The original schematics showed that if the primary power junction, the one I just shorted, registered a complete, catastrophic failure, coupled with a massive, uncontrolled thermal spike, the system bypasses the network and initiates an automatic high-pressure dump to protect the infrastructure. I didn't try to save the network. I sacrificed the network to simulate a system-melting failure, forcing the old mechanical brain to activate the only remaining chemical buffer. He didn't have 10 seconds. He had only the time it took for the surge protector to melt and trip the failsafe relay. As Liam finished speaking, the floor of the cabin vibrated with such force that several ceiling tiles cracked loose and fell. The terrifying hydraulic thump, thump, thump escalated exponentially. Then the entire world outside the control cabin seemed to erupt in a sudden, impossible reverse. Instead of the orange and red flicker of flame, an enormous, billowing cloud of dense, chalky white foam and chemical dust surged skyward from the ground, directly beneath the path of the encroaching fire. It wasn't a slow response, it was instantaneous, violent, and absolute. The chemical agent, an inert high-density polymer foam optimized for immediate thermal absorption, blasted out of dozens of previously unnoticed ground-level ventilation ports along the mouth of the Serpent's Tongue ravine. The pressure was immense. The plume rose hundreds of feet into the air. A massive, brilliant white wall slammed down right in the face of the advancing inferno. The sound was not an explosion, but a gigantic, deafening hiss, the sound of superheated air meeting an ultra-cold, pressurized chemical blanket. Where the fire had been consuming the dry scrub brush and threatening the towering pines, there was now only a rapidly solidifying, suffocating layer of brilliant white suppression agent, instantly choking off the oxygen supply and dropping the ground temperature by hundreds of degrees in a matter of seconds. The initial roar of the wildfire was muffled, silenced, replaced by the persistent, chaotic fizz of the chemical matrix doing its work, encapsulating the burning material in a dense, oxygen-deprived shell. Marcus stumbled back against the console, his eyes wide and stinging from the trace chemicals that had seeped in through the seals. The cabin was suddenly silent, save for the hum of the emergency lights and the heavy, ragged breathing of the head ranger. Where seconds ago there had been an unstoppable conflagration, there was now a surreal, snow-covered landscape of toxic white foam, a sudden, sterile void stretching across the ravine's entrance. The fire, moving at 20 miles per hour, had hit a brick wall of chemistry and high-pressure engineering. It had been cut clean in two. The momentum was broken. The primary path into the reserve was sealed. It took Marcus a full minute to process the impossible sight. The fire still raged furiously on the side it had originated from, but it was now bottlenecked against the chemical barrier, prevented from crossing the critical threshold. The disaster had been averted, not by expertise or technology, but by a precise, calculated act of sabotage aimed at triggering a long-forgotten technical anomaly. Marcus looked at Liam, the rookie who had been ridiculed, questioned, and laughed at, the man who had ignored the protocols of 2 decades and relied instead on dusty blueprints and a deep understanding of historical engineering redundancies. "You shorted the system," Marcus whispered, the adrenaline draining away, replaced by an overwhelming wave of shock and profound humility. "You used a critical failure event to trigger an archaic fire suppression system designed for data centers, not for hectares of woodland." Liam nodded slowly, pulling a charred piece of wire from the terminal junction. It was the only way to bypass the network lock and force maximum pressure instantly. "When you told me we only had 10 seconds, I knew a digital fix was out of the question. I had to create a solution that moved faster than the fire. And the only thing faster than software failure is mechanical reaction." The silence stretched, broken only by the sporadic crackle of the fire dying slowly against the chemical foam. Marcus felt the weight of every condescending remark he had made, every moment he had dismissed Liam's observations because they didn't align with the established procedures he had memorized and lived by for 20 years. "Liam," Marcus finally managed, the word thick with unaccustomed emotion. I apologize. Profoundly, I didn't see it. I couldn't see past the dashboard. I was focused on the system, not the hardware, under the system." "The system tells us what we want to hear, Ranger Marcus," Liam replied, his tone still professional, devoid of triumph. "The hardware tells us what is actually possible. The blueprints showed the pressurized system was tested once a decade ago, barely reaching half capacity. But I noticed that the test parameters assumed the network was intact and regulating pressure. I reasoned that a full catastrophic power failure would eliminate the regulators and force the system to dump everything it had, regardless of the designed safety limits. It was an all-or-nothing move to create an instant, localized ecological choke point. The payoff was monumental. Within the next hour, aerial tankers, finally cleared to fly after the initial catastrophic spread was contained, began focusing their efforts on the now isolated section of the fire. The chemical barrier held fast, impenetrable. The Serpent's Tongue ravine, the supposed pathway to doom, was now the definitive line of defense. The majority of the Oakhaven forest, the ancient, irreplaceable trees and delicate ecosystem, was safe. The investigation that followed was complex and drawn out. Liam's action was technically illegal, a violation of half a dozen safety protocols, and it had resulted in the destruction of the central control network. However, The subsequent analysis of the system logs confirmed Liam's initial assessment. The digital failure had been absolute, and without his intervention the forest would have been lost entirely. Marcus stood by the rookie completely. He provided the necessary context, the timing, the insurmountable odds, and the sheer impossibility of any conventional solution. He explained how his own adherence to protocol had nearly cost them everything, while Liam's radical, lateral thinking, driven by meticulous observation of forgotten documentation, had saved the day. Liam, the rookie who arrived with a notebook full of questions about outdated schematics, was instantly transformed from the department's quiet joke into its reluctant hero. His promotion was swift, though he declined the head ranger position Marcus eventually offered him, preferring to work specifically in historical infrastructure analysis, a department that Marcus promptly created for him. The head ranger himself, humbled and irrevocably changed, took a different lesson. He no longer operated by pure seniority or rote memory. He started listening, truly listening to the unconventional theories, the absurd suggestions, and the quiet observations made by those less experienced, but perhaps less biased by years of procedure. He had learned that sometimes the 10 seconds you have left are not for executing a perfect plan, but for triggering the messy, desperate failsafe that everyone else had forgotten existed. And every time Marcus looked out over the vast green expanse of Oakhaven, he didn't just see the trees. He saw the streak of brilliant white chemical foam that had saved them, a monument to the day a rookie crossed 2 wires and dared to rely on the ghost in the machine. He had learned that true leadership sometimes means knowing when to trust the absurd move, especially when the clock has already run out. If you found yourself gripped by the ticking clock and the tension of a desperate gamble against the odds, consider delving deeper into the world of emergency management and radical problem-solving. Explore the hidden histories of infrastructure failures and the unconventional heroes who found solutions where established systems saw only doom. There are countless stories waiting to be unearthed, tales of those who looked past the primary controls and found salvation in the dusty, forgotten corners of design. Learn how technical literacy combined with pure audacity can rewrite the narrative of catastrophe. The next time you face an impossible deadline, remember Liam and ask yourself, what archaic failsafe is hiding beneath the surface?